Hey, Covenant Church family, Pastor Ryan here with a little bit of time spent with you in one of our readings for today's reading, John chapter 20, verses 24 to 29. It's that very famous passage where Jesus, having risen from the dead, meets with his disciple Thomas. Let's read it together. He says, "Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came." He's referencing what's happened up above in the prior verses. Verse 25, "So the other disciples told him, 'We have seen the Lord.' But he said to them, 'Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe.' 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, 'Peace be with you.' And then he said to Thomas, 'Put your finger here, and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe.' Thomas answered him, 'My Lord and my God.' And Jesus said to him, 'Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." What a wonderful and powerful vignette that the gospel writer John captures for us. You'll remember John has written his entire gospel for what he tells us 2 verses later in verse 31, that by writing these things, by including these things in his narrative, John wants us to believe that Jesus, it says, is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, that we might have life in his name. So, John is telling us that Thomas had his doubts. He had his questions about who Jesus was. You remember, I'm not going to believe unless I place my fingers in his side, my hand in his side, and my fingers in the place where the marks of the nails were. Jesus, knowing this somehow, comes to Thomas and he says, "Thomas, put your fingers here. Thomas, place your hand here." Now, why do you think John is including this? Well, I think he's telling us this in a couple of ways. One, this is not what you place in your narrative if you want to give a picture of what perfect faith looks like. Thomas had his doubts. And therefore, John is showing us that part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus is to have questions and to have doubts. What's that like for you? Where do you have your doubts? What questions do you have? What ones have you had in your past? John is showing us through Thomas that our questions are part of the everyday experience of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. That true biblical faith is not devoid of its questions, but rather includes them and brings them to Jesus. And secondly, therefore, it's showing us that Jesus actually meets us in the midst of our questions and our doubts. Remember, he looks at Thomas and says, "Thomas, you've got these questions. Bring them to me. Place your hand here. Put it in my side. And in so doing, Thomas, I want you to quit disbelieving." That's what I love. You see, we're actually really soft on Thomas by calling him a doubter. There's a willfulness here in Thomas's unbelief. He doesn't want to believe. He's strong in his unbelief. And Jesus calls forth belief in him, having answered Thomas's doubts. The same goes for you and me, brothers and sisters. I don't know what those questions might be for you, and you're not going to get to touch Jesus like Thomas did. But whatever those doubts and questions are, Jesus invites you to bring them to him, and he will meet them through his word and by his Spirit. And this is really encouraging for you and for me today, because I don't know about you, but it's often assumed in my mind that if I was really a good Christian, that if I really had strong faith, the questions and doubts would not be a part of that. Or if I just got to see Jesus, then I wouldn't have the struggles that I did. The Bible just tells us something different. It gives us people like Thomas. It gives us the disciples. You remember Matthew chapter 28. Jesus is about to descend. And it says that his disciples were gathered around. The 11 were gathered around and they worshiped him. Then the text tells us, but some doubted. Brothers and sisters, I want you to see today that Jesus is saying, your doubts, your questions are welcome with me. The great writer from the 11th century, a man by the name of Anselm of Canterbury, had this very famous phrase. Translated into English, it meant that belief is faith seeking understanding. That biblical belief in Jesus is not having all of our questions answered before we believe in Him, but rather faith begins as a mustard seed. It begins by resting in Jesus, and then throughout the course of our life, having the questions, having our doubts that we have answered by Him. Well, no matter where this finds you today, I hope that you have a great day. And until we meet again, grace and peace, and may the Lord be near to each of you. Have a great one. Bye-bye.